The humidity of a Manhattan morning clung to the glass and steel of the Aura Cosmetics headquarters, but inside the lobby, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled faintly of expensive lavender and success. Maya Vance stepped through the revolving doors, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the pristine white marble floor. She felt the weight of the cardboard box in her arms, its edges softened by a morning spent in a dusty warehouse. She was dressed in an oversized gray hoodie that had seen better days, stained with a few splashes of organic hibiscus dye, and simple black leggings. Her hair, however, was a masterpiece, intricate bantu knots coiled tightly against her scalp, adorned with tiny, shimmering gold filigree clips that caught the light of the morning sun. She looked like a woman who had been working with her hands, a woman focused on the craft rather than the costume. To Julian Thorne, standing near the executive elevator bank, she looked like a mistake. Julian adjusted the cuff of his $2,000 charcoal suit, his eyes scanning the lobby with the predatory sharpness of a man who believed the world was his personal gallery. He was 35, polished to a mirror shine, and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When his gaze landed on Maya, his lip curled in an involuntary twitch of disgust. He didn't see the founder of the empire he worked for, he saw a loiterer, a blemish on the high-end aesthetic he spent his life curating. He checked his rose gold watch, huffing a sigh of performative impatience, and then snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack, echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't walk toward her, he summoned her with a flick of his wrist. When Maya didn't immediately scramble toward him, Julian's face flushed a deep, agitated red. He marched over, his Italian leather loafers clicking with an aggressive rhythm. He stopped 3 feet away, not even bothering to look her in the eye. Instead, his eyes fixed on her hair. He stared at the bantu knots as if they were something offensive he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. He let out a short, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark. He asked her if she realized where she was, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that felt like venom. He told her that the service entrance was tucked away in the alley for a reason and that people with hair like that, unkempt, unprofessional yarnballs, as he put it, shouldn't be seen in the main lobby. Maya tightened her grip on the box, her knuckles turning white against the cardboard. She didn't flinch, she didn't look down, she looked directly into Julian's pale, arrogant eyes and told him calmly that she had a 10 o'clock meeting on the penthouse floor. The statement only made Julian's smirk widen into a full, jagged sneer. He leaned in closer, bringing with him the suffocating scent of overpriced cologne. He told her that the only meeting she had was with a mop and a bucket, assuming she was part of the weekend cleaning crew who had lost her way. He reached out, his hand darting toward the box she was holding, his fingers gripping the edge with a sudden, violent tug. He claimed she was likely stealing company property, his voice rising so that the early morning interns and a few security guards would turn their heads to witness the spectacle. The struggle was brief but clumsy. Julian jerked the box upward, and the lack of resistance caused it to tip precariously. A dozen small glass jars, enlabeled and filled with rich, earthy-colored creams, tumbled out. They shattered and rolled across the marble, the scents of shea butter and cold-pressed oils blooming in the air. Julian didn't look remorseful, he looked triumphant. He stepped back, gesturing to the mess on the floor as if it were proof of her incompetence and her status. He shouted for security, his voice echoing with an entitled authority that made the air in the lobby feel thin. He told the approaching guards to get the trash out of his sight, claiming she was ruining the brand's image before the real VIPs arrived. Maya stood among the ruins of her prototypes, her gold-clipped knots reflecting the overhead lights like a crown. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She simply told him that beauty was skin-deep, but that his ignorance seemed to go all the way to the bone. Julian just laughed, a hollow, cruel sound, as he watched the guards take her by the arms, convinced he had just cleared a path for his own greatness. The golden afternoon sun of 20 years ago bled through the tall, arched windows of St. Jude's Private Academy, but it brought no warmth to the principal's office. A young Maya sat in a stiff wooden chair, her feet barely touching the floor, her small hands trembling in her lap. Opposite her, the principal sighed with an air of practiced regret, tapping a fountain pen against a copy of the student handbook. He didn't look at Maya's face, he looked at her head. He told her mother, who sat beside her with shoulders tight and weary, that the school's grooming policy was very clear about distractions. He described Maya's neat, colorful braids as a violation of the aesthetic standards the academy worked so hard to maintain. He said that if Maya wanted to walk across the stage at the upcoming honors ceremony, she would have to come back with a more appropriate and refined look. Maya's mother didn't argue. She couldn't afford to. She was a woman who smelled of coconut oil and peppermint, her hands always stained with the dyes and lotions of the 3 different salons where she pulled double shifts. That night, the kitchen table became a place of quiet, rhythmic sorrow. Maya sat on a low stool while her mother worked, the sharp, acrid scent of a chemical relaxer filling the small apartment. Maya remembered the way the white cream felt like fire against her scalp, a burning sensation that seemed to seep into her very soul. She watched her beautiful braids fall into the trash can one by one, replaced by bone-straight hair that hung limp and lifeless. Her mother's tears fell silently onto Maya's shoulders, each drop a testament to the cost of fitting into a world that wasn't built for them. It was in that moment, with the sting of chemicals in her eyes, that Maya made a silent vow. She promised herself that one day she would build a world where no one had to burn themselves away to be seen as professional. In a different part of the city, during that same era, a young Julian Thorne was learning a very different lesson. He stood on a manicured lawn, his arms crossed, watching his father speak to a local code enforcement officer. His father was pointing a gold-ringed finger at a small, vibrant Caribbean grocery store on the corner, complaining that the loud colors and the type of people it attracted were driving down the neighborhood's property values. Julian's father turned to him and told him that the world was divided into those who set the standards and those who failed to meet them. He taught Julian that power was about exclusion, about knowing who didn't belong and having the guts to remove them. Julian watched as the shop owner was handed a fine he clearly couldn't pay, and for the first time, Julian felt the intoxicating rush of being on the side that held the gavel. The memories faded as the harsh fluorescent lights of the modern-day police precinct snapped Maya back to the present. She sat on a cold metal bench, the gold clips in her bantu knots catching the reflection of a passing officer's badge. She had spent the last 6 months in a remote village, her hands stained with the same hibiscus dyes her mother once used, perfecting a formula that didn't require fire or pain. She had intentionally stayed away, working under the pseudonym, MV Creations, to see if the leadership she'd hired could handle the empire without her face in the lobby. She realized now that she had been too successful at staying hidden. Julian Thorne, hired by a board that valued his aggressive marketing stats, had never seen a single photo of the woman who signed his checks. He had only seen a girl in a hoodie with distracting hair, and his father's voice had told him exactly what to do with her. Maya felt a vibration in her pocket and pulled out her phone. It was Marcus, the only person in the building who truly knew who she was. The text was short, informing her that Julian was already in her office, bragging to the staff about how he had handled a trespasser. Maya looked at her reflection in the scratched plexiglass of the precinct window. She saw the little girl from St. Jude's, but the eyes looking back were different now. They weren't seeking permission anymore. She stood up, smoothing the front of her stained hoodie with a quiet, terrifying dignity. The tension in her chest wasn't fear. Nerves were for people who didn't know the ending of the story. Maya knew exactly how this ended. She began to type a message to the board of directors, her thumbs moving with a deliberate, lethal precision. The storm had arrived, and it was finally time for Julian Thorne to learn that some standards were meant to be burned to the ground. Julian Thorne did not stop at the lobby. For him, the humiliation of the woman with the bantu knots was a sport, a way to flex his newfound dominance before the afternoon's big announcement. He found Maya an hour later, sitting on a concrete bench just outside the building's massive revolving doors, her cardboard box resting at her feet. She was staring at the shattered glass of her product jars on the pavement, her expression unreadable. Julian stepped out into the humid air, his smartphone already held aloft like a weapon. He didn't just walk, he strutted, a wide, predatory grin stretching across his face as he tapped the record button. He began to narrate to his followers in a loud, performative voice, mocking the urban decor that had tried to infiltrate the corporate sanctum. He zoomed the camera in on her hair, making a gagging sound for the benefit of his digital audience, laughing about how some people clearly didn't get the memo that Aura Cosmetics was a luxury brand, not a street festival. The isolation was total. Suits and high heels hurried past them, eyes averted. To the busy professionals of Manhattan, Maya was just another invisible problem, a girl in a stained hoodie being lectured by a man who looked like he belonged. No one stopped to ask her side of the story. No one offered a hand to help her pick up the spilled creams. The silence of the crowd was a heavy, suffocating weight, reinforcing the boundary Julian had drawn between the valuable and the disposable. Julian's laughter grew louder, fueled by the lack of interference. He looked around at the bystanders, seeking an audience for his cruelty, and found Sarah, the HR manager, stepping out for a coffee break. Sarah was dressed in a sleek, ivory power suit, her eyes shielded by designer sunglasses. Julian waved her over, his voice dripping with false concern. He told Sarah that they had a major security breach, pointing his phone at Maya as if she were a laboratory specimen. Sarah didn't look at Maya's face. She looked at the paint stains on the hoodie and the distracting hair. She let out a sharp, irritated sigh, checking her watch with a flick of her wrist. She told Maya that if she didn't pack up her trash and disappear within the next 60 seconds, she would personally call the police to have her charged with criminal trespassing and harassment. She whispered that Aura had a premium stock price to protect, and that her kind of aesthetic was actively hurting the brand's image. Sarah's voice wasn't loud, but it was cold, the kind of professional frost that had frozen out countless dreams before they could even begin. Then came the final move. Julian's eyes glittered with a sudden, dark inspiration. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for a moment, and then let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. He began to pat his pockets frantically, shouting that his limited edition gold watch, the one his father had given him, was missing. He pointed a trembling finger at Maya's cardboard box, screaming to the gathering crowd that the homeless girl had used the elevator distraction to rob him blind. It was a lie so bold and so sudden that it paralyzed the air. Before Maya could even stand up, Julian was flagging down a passing patrol car, his voice rising into a frantic, high-pitched wail of victimhood. Maya looked up at him, her gaze steady and terrifyingly calm. She asked him one simple question, if he was absolutely sure he wanted to take this path. Julian leaned down, his face inches from hers, the camera still rolling. He whispered that he was the new king of the company, and that she was nothing but a footnote in a police report that no one would ever read. Marcus stood by the glass doors, his knuckles white as he clutched his own phone, recording the entire encounter from the shadows. He saw the police officers exit their vehicle, their hands resting on their belts. He saw them pull Maya's arms behind her back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing against the cold stone of the building. Maya didn't struggle, she didn't scream. As they led her toward the cruiser, she looked back at Julian, who was currently taking a celebratory selfie with the police lights flashing blue and red against his smug, triumphant face. He thought he had ended her, but as the door of the police car slammed shut, Maya's silence felt less like a defeat and more like the quiet before a landslide. The fluorescent lights of the precinct's interrogation room hummed with a low, sterile buzz that seemed to vibrate against the metal table where Maya sat, her hands still resting where the cuffs had been moments before. The door opened with a heavy thud, and Captain Miller walked in, his expression not one of suspicion, but of deep, visible mortification. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down slowly, clearing his throat as he laid a folder on the table. He looked at Maya, then at the golden filigree in her bantu knots, and finally at her eyes, which held a stillness that made him shift uncomfortably. He told her that he had just received a direct call from the city's highest commissioner and that his officers had committed a catastrophic error. He apologized with a sincerity that was rare for a man of his rank, stating that they had no idea who she actually was. Maya simply nodded, rubbing the faint red marks on her wrists, her mind already miles away from the small, gray room. To the rest of the world, Maya Vance had vanished into the jaws of the justice system. Back at the Aura Cosmetics headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with a misplaced sense of triumph. Julian Thorne was not just working, he was celebrating. He had moved his personal belongings into the expansive, glass-walled CEO office, tossing his designer coat over the leather chair that didn't belong to him yet. He held an impromptu gathering in the break room, leaning against the marble counter as he replayed the video of Maya's arrest for a group of eager subordinates. He laughed about how easy it was to spot someone who didn't belong, mocking the way she had looked sitting on that bench with her yarn balls and her box of junk. He told the staff that today was a cleansing, a necessary removal of the rot that held back the brand's true potential. He felt invincible, the undisputed king of a mountain he hadn't even climbed. But Maya was not defeated. After leaving the precinct, she didn't head to a lawyer's office or go home to hide. Instead, she was driven to a high-end, secure facility on the outskirts of the city. A place where the real gears of her empire turned. She sat in a room filled with monitors, the glow of the screens illuminating the sharp, determined lines of her face. She wasn't just a creator anymore, she was a strategist. She opened a digital file that Marcus had quietly compiled over the last few months. It was a ledger of Julian's hidden transgressions, including a series of suspicious transfers from the company's diversity and inclusion funds into an offshore account to cover a spiraling gambling debt. The evidence was damning, a digital paper trail that led directly to the man currently drinking champagne in her office. Her mindset shifted with the cold precision of a closing trap. She realized that reacting with anger was what a victim would do, and Maya Vance was nobody's victim. She decided to play the long game. A game where the payoff wasn't just a firing, but a total dismantling of the ego that had tried to crush her. She picked up her secure phone and called the board of directors, her voice dropping into a register of commanding authority they hadn't heard in years. She told them to cancel the afternoon briefing and to move the new leadership announcement to the grand gala that evening. She instructed them to invite every major news outlet and influencer in the industry. She wanted a stage, and she wanted the lights to be as bright as possible. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the city, Maya looked at a photograph of her mother clipped to the corner of her desk. She remembered the fire of the chemical relaxer and the quiet dignity of a woman who worked until her fingers bled. She realized that her humble appearance that morning hadn't been a mistake, it had been a test, and the people she had entrusted with her legacy had failed it spectacularly. She told Marcus to let Julian keep believing he was the victor, to let him marinate in his own hubris for a few more hours. She spent the rest of the day not in a state of mourning, but in a state of preparation, weaving a narrative of justice that was far more permanent than any police report. She wasn't just going to reclaim her seat, she was going to redefine what it meant to sit in it. The transformation began not in a boardroom, but in a small, sunlight-drenched salon in Harlem that smelled of peppermint, burnt sugar, and history. Maya sat in the swivel chair, watching in the mirror as a stylist's nimble fingers worked through her hair. She had decided not to hide the Bantu knots that Julian had so viciously mocked, instead, she chose to elevate them. She watched as thin, delicate threads of 24-karat gold were woven into the base of each knot, turning her hair into a literal crown that shimmered with every movement of her head. This was her grind, the silent preparation of a queen reclaiming a throne that was already hers. She wasn't just getting ready for a party, she was armor-plating her identity. Between the rhythmic tugs on her scalp, Maya worked her smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen as she reviewed the final audit of Julian's department. The numbers didn't lie. He had been siphoning thousands from the company's diversity initiatives, treating the budget like a personal slush fund to pay off high-stakes debts at a private underground casino. It was a cold, calculated betrayal of everything Aura Cosmetics stood for, and Maya felt a grim satisfaction knowing that the paper trail ended exactly at his mahogany desk. Across town, Julian Thorne was experiencing a very different kind of preparation. He stood in front of a three-way mirror at an elite Fifth Avenue tailor, admiring the way a $5,000 tuxedo hugged his frame. He felt like a god. He laughed as he checked his reflection, imagining the look on everyone's faces when he was officially named CEO. He took a sip of vintage scotch and turned to his tailor, bragging about how he had spent the morning, taking out the trash. He described the woman in the lobby with a sneer, telling the tailor that some people simply don't have the DNA for luxury. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he didn't notice the subtle red flags popping up around him. When he tried to use his executive keycard to access the restricted server room to delete his browsing history, it blinked a stubborn, solid red. He dismissed it as a technical glitch, a minor annoyance on the greatest day of his life. He was so far gone in his own hubris that he actually believed the silence from the board of directors was a sign of their hushed awe for his leadership. While Julian preened, Maya was moving pieces on a much larger chessboard. She met with her legal team in a dimly lit limousine parked a block away from the gala venue. The air inside the car was cool and smelled of expensive leather and old paper. Her lead attorney handed her a heavy, gold-embossed folder containing a termination for cause contract. It included a morality clause so ironclad that it would strip Julian of every stock option, every bonus, and every cent of his severance. Maya flipped through the pages, her eyes cold and focused. She wasn't just firing him, she was erasing him from the industry. She then sent a cryptic, company-wide notification that the mystery founder would be making a rare personal appearance at the gala. She knew the news would spread like wildfire through the office, reaching Julian just as he was at his peak of arrogance. Among the flurry of preparations, Maya took a moment to address a different kind of business. She reached out to Elena, the junior designer who had watched the lobby confrontation with tearful, helpless eyes. Maya didn't reveal her identity yet, but she sent Elena a personal invitation to the gala's VIP section, along with a message telling her to bring her most ambitious portfolio. Maya remembered the crushing weight of being a silent witness to injustice, and she wanted to ensure that Elena's career would be the first thing she built up once the dust settled. As the sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline, painting the skyscrapers in hues of bruised purple and orange, Maya looked at her reflection one last time. The gold in her hair blazed in the fading light. She looked powerful, she looked ready, and most importantly, she looked like herself. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and all that was left was for the curtain to rise on Julian's final act. The Starlight Ballroom was a cavern of crystal and light, shimmering with the artificial glow of 1,000 floating candles and the sharp, rhythmic flashes of paparazzi bulbs. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne, a sensory overload designed to broadcast power and prestige. Julian Thorne moved through the crowd like he was already king, his tuxedo jacket buttoned perfectly, a glass of crystal-clear gin in one hand. He was surrounded by a gaggle of high-level investors and his usual sycophants, including Sarah from HR, who was currently laughing far too loudly at one of his jokes. Julian leaned into a group of potential partners, his voice lowered just enough to invite them into his inner circle of cruelty. He began to tell the story of his morning, describing the homeless-looking woman who had tried to infiltrate the lobby with her messy yarn balls and stained clothes. He painted a picture of himself as the brave defender of the corporate aesthetic, a man who knew how to keep the riffraff out of the temple of luxury. As he reached the punchline of his story, Julian's eyes drifted toward the grand entrance of the ballroom, and his laughter died in his throat. A woman was walking through the double doors, and for a split second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She was draped in a floor-length gown of liquid gold silk that clung to her silhouette like a second skin, moving with the heavy grace of molten metal. But it was her hair that truly stopped the hearts of the attendees. The Bantu knots were no longer hidden or humble, they were woven with shimmering 24-karat gold wire and tiny, sparkling diamonds that caught every beam of light in the room, creating a literal halo around her head. Julian didn't recognize her at first, all he saw was a rival for the spotlight. He felt a surge of hot, petty jealousy. He whispered to Sarah, demanding to know who the social climber was and how she had bypassed his guest list. Then, the woman turned, and the blood drained from Julian's face so fast it left him dizzy. It was her, the girl from the lobby. The thief he had filmed and mocked and handed over to the police in handcuffs. He watched as she glided past the most powerful CEOs in the city, greeting them with a subtle, authoritative nod that spoke of decades of shared history. Julian's grip tightened on his glass until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't believe his eyes. he convinced himself it was a twin, or perhaps a cruel joke played by his rivals. He signaled to Bradley and Sarah, his voice a frantic, low-pitched hiss. He told them that the vagrant from this morning had somehow stolen a dress and sneaked into the gala, and that he was going to end this charade before she could embarrass the company further. Julian intercepted her near the center of the ballroom, stepping into her path with a smirk that was meant to be intimidating but looked more like a nervous twitch. He didn't offer a greeting. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of gin and malice. He asked her if she thought a fancy dress and a bit of gold wire could hide the fact that she was a nobody from the streets. He told her that he was about to call security and have her dragged out in front of everyone, making sure the humiliation this time was permanent. He gestured to her hair, his lip curling in that familiar, jagged sneer, and told her that ethnic decorations didn't change the fact that she was a diversity hire who had finally overstayed her welcome. Maya didn't move, she didn't look hurt, and she certainly didn't look afraid. She stood her ground with the stillness of a mountain, her eyes locked onto his with a terrifying, piercing clarity. She let him finish his tirade, watching as he grew more animated and desperate, his face turning a blotchy, agitated red. When he finally stopped to take a breath, she simply leaned in and whispered that he should enjoy his last 30 seconds of relevance, because the view from the top was about to become very lonely for him. Before Julian could respond with another insult, the lights in the ballroom began to dim, and a deep, resonant chime echoed through the speakers. The chairman of the board stepped onto the stage, his voice booming over the microphone as he announced that it was finally time to meet the woman who had built Aura Cosmetics from a single kitchen table into a global empire. Julian stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, as the spotlight began to move across the room, searching for its target. The heavy velvet curtains on the stage parted as the spotlight finally ceased its restless dancing, locking onto the woman in the gold silk gown with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. A hush so profound it felt physical smothered the room. Julian stood paralyzed, his champagne glass tilted at a precarious angle, a drop of golden liquid splashing onto his polished shoe. He didn't feel it. He was watching the woman move. She didn't scurry, she ascended. Every step she took toward the stage was a rhythmic strike against his soul. The chairman reached out a hand, his face split into a grin of genuine reverence, and spoke into the microphone. He introduced her as the architect of their industry, the visionary who had spent months in the trenches of research to bring them the future of beauty. He officially welcomed the CEO and founder of Aura Cosmetics, Ms. Maya Vance. The applause was a thunderclap, but for Julian, it was a muffled roar from the bottom of an ocean. He watched Maya take the microphone, the diamonds in her bantu knots sparkling like a constellation under the high-intensity stage lights. She didn't look like the girl from the lobby anymore, she looked like the person who owned the air he was breathing. She looked down at him from the stage, and for the first time, Julian felt the true, icy weight of his own insignificance. He tried to scramble backward, his face a ghostly mask of gray and white, his knees buckling. He looked at Sarah and Bradley, searching for an ally, but they had already recoiled from him as if he were radioactive, their eyes wide with the terror of their own complicity. Maya didn't begin with a thank you. Instead, she signaled to the technical booth. The massive high-definition screens that flanked the stage flickered to life, but they didn't show product shots or sales charts. They showed a grainy, vertically shot video from a smartphone. The ballroom went silent as Julian's own voice filled the space, amplified to a deafening volume. Everyone watched as Julian snapped his fingers at a woman in a hoodie. They heard him call her hair a bird's nest. They watched him deliberately tilt her box and sneer as her life's work shattered on the marble. The video didn't stop there. It showed the moment he planted his watch, the moment he called the police, and the moment he laughed as she was led away in handcuffs. The cruelty was raw, undeniable, and broadcast in 80-inch clarity to the most influential people in the country. Maya spoke then, her voice not trembling with anger, but vibrating with a terrifying, absolute authority. She told the audience that earlier that day, a man had told her that people with her hair belonged in the basement. She looked directly at Julian, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. She told him that he was right about one thing. image is everything. And the image the world was seeing now was of a man who was small. A man who was a thief of both company funds and human dignity. She reached into the gold-leafed folder on the podium and held up a single sheet of paper. She informed him that his embezzlement had been tracked. His watch was a GPS prototype she had designed to catch snakes in her grass, and his employment was officially terminated for cause effective the second he had insulted a woman who had worked 20 years to build the floor he was standing on. She leaned into the microphone, her eyes burning with a fire that seemed to outshine the gold in her hair. She delivered the final blow with a surgical precision, telling Julian that he had wanted her out of his lobby, so now, she was taking his entire world out of hers. As she spoke, 2 uniformed officers entered from the back of the ballroom, the same metallic clink of handcuffs that had silenced Maya that morning now ringing out for him. Julian began to wail, a high-pitched, pathetic sound of a man who had lost everything, begging for a mercy he had never once shown. Maya didn't watch them drag him out. She turned back to the audience, adjusted her crown of gold-threaded knots, and began to speak about the true meaning of beauty, leaving the wreckage of Julian Thorne's career on the ballroom floor like the shattered glass he had forced her to clean. The heavy, double mahogany doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind the police officers, swallowing Julian Thorne's frantic pleas for mercy. Inside, a strange, electric silence settled over the elite crowd, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the city traffic 60 stories below. Maya Vance stood at the podium, the gold threads in her hair catching the soft glow of the chandeliers, looking less like a conqueror and more like a woman who had finally found her breath. She didn't bask in the destruction of her enemy. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the back of the room where Elena, the junior designer, stood trembling with a mixture of shock and awe. Maya spoke into the microphone, her voice now warm and resonant, announcing that the company's new creative direction would be led by those who saw beauty in every texture and every story. She beckoned Elena forward, welcoming her into a future that was no longer guarded by gatekeepers, but opened by creators. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of systemic dismantling. Sarah from HR and Bradley from marketing found their desks cleared before the sun had even fully risen the next day. Maya didn't just fire them, she sat them down and looked them in the eye, explaining that their silence in the face of Julian's cruelty was just as toxic as the insults themselves. She stripped away the culture of fear and replaced it with one of radical dignity. Even Mrs. Sterling, the neighbor who had looked down her nose at Maya in the elevator for years, found her world shifting. When she tried to renew her lease on her luxury apartment, she was met with a polite but firm denial, signed by the building's holding company, a subsidiary of Aura Cosmetics. Justice was not a loud explosion, it was a quiet, steady rain that washed away the dirt of the past. 5 years later, the Manhattan skyline looked much the same, but the heart of Aura Cosmetics had been entirely reborn. Maya sat in her office, which was no longer a cold fortress of glass, but a warm, vibrant space filled with the scents of hibiscus and shea butter. Her daughter, a bright-eyed girl of 7, sat on the plush rug by the window, her own hair styled in beautiful, bouncy coils that she touched with effortless pride. Maya watched her, a soft smile playing on her lips, remembering the fire of the chemicals and the shame of the principal's office. Those days were a ghost story now, a distant memory used only to teach her daughter the most important lesson of all. She told her child that people would always try to tell her who she was based on what they saw in the mirror, but that a mirror only shows the surface. True power, she whispered, is the courage to be the person who signs the checks, the person who builds the bridges, and the person who never forgets the feel of the cardboard box in their hands. Deep in the bowels of a sprawling distribution center on the edge of the city, a man in a faded, sweat-stained uniform pulled a heavy hairnet over his thinning hair. Julian Thorne looked at his reflection in a cracked, grimy bathroom mirror, his hands calloused and his designer watch long ago sold to pay for legal fees. He stepped out onto the warehouse floor, his sneakers squeaking on the cold concrete as he began his shift. Above his head, a massive digital billboard flickered to life, displaying a vibrant, beautiful image of Maya Vance. She was smiling, her gold-threaded bantu knots glowing like a halo, under the bold, shimmering text. True beauty is found in integrity. Julian looked up for a fleeting second, the irony of bitter pill he had to swallow every single day, before he lowered his head and got back to work. He finally understood that the crown Maya wore was never made of gold, it was made of the unshakable truth that you should never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when the person you are insulting today will be the one who owns your tomorrow.